And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we're going to continue to think about prices. On previous podcasts, we talked about price indexes, and now we're going to use the price indexes to calculate something that most people are more familiar with, and that is inflation. So first of all, let's define inflation. Inflation is the percent change in prices from one year to the next. So this is a one-year calculation when we're looking at inflation. It's a percent change in prices from one year to the next. Now, let me just contrast that very quickly with a price index or a price level. A price index is the percent change in prices since the base year. And the base year could have been last year, it could have been 10 years ago, it could have been 20 years ago, it could have been 100 years ago. Okay? So the price index is measuring percent changes since a base year. Inflation is measuring percent change in prices since the previous year. It's a one-year calculation. So I will show you a little bit later in the video, or coming up here pretty soon. I will show you the difference between the two. I will contrast the two in a few moments. But let's first look at the formula for the inflation rate. The formula is we use these price indexes to calculate the rate of inflation. So we take the price index for the current year that we're studying, and I'll show you an example of this, minus the price index from the previous year, because remember, this is just a one-year calculation from the current year back to the previous year, all divided by the price index of the previous year times 100. So that will calculate the inflation rate. So let me go back 2 slides here. Let's go back and look at these numbers that we looked at before on the previous podcast. And I'm going to look at year 6 to year 7. From year 7 to year 8. I'm going to look at those two. So from year 7 to year 8, over that time period, the price index for year 7 was 80. So that meant prices were 80% higher than they were in the base year. Sorry, I just said that wrong. But our price index, let's try that again. The price index was 80. Now we have to subtract 100 from that to say what it means. So I was just getting ahead of myself. What that means is 80 minus 100. That means prices are 20% below where they were back here in the base year. So let me just say that one more time because I misspoke. I got ahead of myself. A price index of 80 minus 100 means the prices are 20% below where they were in the base year. Okay? And then take a look at 8. In year 8, the price index was 120. That means the prices minus 100, prices were 20% higher than they were back here in the base year. Prices are 20% higher than they were in the base year. But these two things are not inflation, okay? They are price indexes that are measuring changes in prices connected back to the base year, okay? That's a different thing. That's a price index. Now let's calculate the rate of inflation from year 7 to year 8. So we're going to need the price index from year 7, which is 80, and we're going to need the price index from year 8, which is 120. All right, let's go back to the formula. Our inflation rate is calculated by taking, so here comes the inflation rate from year 7 to year 8. The inflation rate is equal to the price index of the current year, which was 120, that was in year 8, minus the price index of the previous year, that was year 7 when the price index was 80. All divided by the price, so that's the change. That's the change in the price index. All divided by the price index the previous year, which was 80, and then you multiply that by 100. You multiply that by 100. And so then inflation would be the change in the price index was 40. That's 120 minus 80, divided by the price index the previous year, which was 80. Multiply that by 100, and you get a rate of inflation of 50%. So let's talk about what that 50% number means. So let's go back to my chart again. Sorry for jumping around here. So what that means is this. That means that from year 7 to year 8, prices went up by 50%. Prices went up by 50%. That is the idea of inflation. That's the idea of inflation. So let me say this all over again. A price index is the percent change in prices, gives us the percent change in prices since the base year. So we take my 80, subtract away 100, and we can say prices are 20% lower than they were back here in the base year. Year 8, the price index is 120 minus 100 gives me 20. Prices were 20% higher than they were back in the base year. These are both percent changes that are connecting back to the base year. I've said that a lot of times now. In contrast to that, inflation is the percent change in prices from one year to the next. From one year to the next, prices from year 7 to year 8, prices went up by 50%. Now, let's do this. These are just kind of with my made-up numbers. So let's go do this with some real numbers. So let me bring up some real statistics. So this is looking at let's look at the year 2012, and I want to calculate the price, the inflation from 2011 to 2012. Okay, so here are my dates, and this line right here, these are the price indexes. So they mean what? In 2012, the price index was 229.6. So subtract 100, prices are 129.6% higher than they were back in the base years, which was 1982 to 1984. We said that on a previous podcast. In 2011, the price index was 224.9. That means prices that year minus 100 were 124.9% higher than they were back in the base year, 1982 to 1984. Okay? That's what the price index means. But now let's calculate the rate of inflation. The rate of inflation is the percent change in prices from 2011 to 2012. Okay, so we got to keep these numbers in our heads. In 2012, the price index was 229.6. In 2011, it was 224.9. So let's go back to our chart here and let's calculate the rate of inflation. So we're going to do the rate of inflation, and this is going to be the rate of inflation from 2011 to 2012. From 2011 to 2012. So we're going to use the price of the current year, that's 2012. The price index was, if I remember my numbers correctly, it was 229.6. minus the price index in 2011, that's the previous year, it was 224.9. And if you needed to, of course, you can go just, rewind back on the video and go to the chart and look at those numbers. And then we divide all of that by the price index of the previous year, which was the 224.9. That was in 2011. Multiply that all by 100. Okay, so you do your subtraction first, then divide by 224.9, then multiply it by 100, and if you do all that, I get a rate of inflation from 2011 to 2012. I get a rate of inflation of 2.08%, which they're going to round to about 2.1%. That would be the rate of inflation. Let's go check that out. Let's check out some rates of inflation. Let's see if we got that right. So let me go back to my chart here. So in 2012, price index was 229.6. That means prices were 129.6% higher than they were back in the base year. The rate of inflation, there it is, was 2.1%. That means prices were 2.1% higher than they were in 2011. That's the rate of inflation for 2012. 12. Let's just go back and look at some rates of inflation, and then we'll finish up on this video. So here are some rates of inflation, some recent rates of inflation: 2.1%, 3.2%, 1.6%. Okay, those are a little bit low. You typically are going to see a rate of inflation of 3 to 4%, something like that would kind of be the sweet spot. In 2009, when we went through the Great Recession, we actually suffered negative inflation. We'll talk about that on a future video, what that means. But prices actually went down by 0.4%. Okay. Before that, there's our 3%, almost 3%, 3.2, 3.4, 2.7. Yeah, kind of very average rates of inflation. Let me see if I can slide this over a little bit so that we can look at some previous years. Sorry about this. Keep sliding that over. Let's go back into the 1980s, into the tail of the end of the 1980s. Rate of inflation is 1.9%, which is a pretty big deal because just before that, inflation was very high. I'll show it to you here in a second. 1988. We were at 4.1%. 1990, we were 5.4. That's a little high, but then we came back down: 4.2, 3, 3, 2.6, and so on. Okay, let me jump to the second chart where I can look from 1929 to into the 1980s, and here we're going to get a rate of inflation of this line right here. Look at this. In 1929, 0% inflation. 1933, we had negative inflation. 1939, negative inflation. All through the 30s, we have negative inflation. We'll talk about that. That's going to be a big deal later. 1942, rate of inflation is 10.9%. That's really high. 8.3%, 8.1%. This is all kind of World War II is kind of messing with the data here. So this, Great Depression in the 30s, World War II, sorry for moving that, World War II in the 40s. Okay, let's move ahead again. And I just want to look at the inflation rates getting into the 1970s. So here we go. This goes up. We'll go up to 1982 here. So if we look at the rate of inflation through the 60s, everything's looking pretty normal. 1.7, 1, 1.3, 2.9, 4.2. 5.7 is a little high. 3.2, we're back down. But look what happens in 1974. 1974, rate of inflation, 11%. We need to talk about the 1970s on a future video and what was going on there. 1976, 5.8. 1978, 7.6%. 1980, 13.5%. Those are high rates of inflation for the United States. And we need to try to figure out why are some periods inflation low and other periods inflation is high. How do we explain it, and what kind of policies can we use to deal with those? Anyway, I'm going to stop there. I've gone a little bit longer than I wanted to. So there's some inflation data. We'll talk more about inflation on a future podcast. This has been Mr. Hagan. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.